Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope everybody's having a beautiful day. I hope the sun is shining, the birds are singing, the wind is at your back. I have an incredible topic and an incredible show and an incredible guest for you today. When you listen to my voice and you hear the words translational regenerative medicine, what do you think? When I think about it and the person with whom we're going to learn more about it, we're going to investigate that it is the bridge between groundbreaking scientific discoveries and real world applications that have the potential to transform healthcare forever. It represents the journey from laboratory innovation to practical solutions, where scientific insights are harnessed to heal and regenerate tissues, organs, and ultimately lives. It's a fascinating area, and we are going to learn much more about it today with my guest, the one and only Elle Edin. She's the CSO of Biomimetics, CEO of Edin AI, and we are going to get into this world of what she's up to and how she got here. Elle, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's a good day.
It's a beautiful day. And we are on the cusp of real revolutions in healthcare. And I was hopeful that maybe you could fill in a little bit of background about who you are and where you got to be today.
Absolutely. So I'm originally Swedish. I went to university in Linköping at Linköping University. I had a stint at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and I got my PhD from Uppsala University, which is very close to Stockholm. It's one of the oldest institutions in the world, and I really love my time there. So I'm always phoning a bit about it. Yeah, I started out in genetics and uh, worked sort of on the interface between industry and academia there. I was working on a grant that was co-sponsored by pharma. And from there, I already then knew that I wanted to work in regenerative medicine. And I had my sights set on medical device, specifically within regenerative medicine. It just happens to be that my boss at the time had a former coworker or someone who used to be to work with him at Harvard when he was there. So that was in the same city. So he kind of scooted me over there. And that's how I started working in medical device and regenerative medicine. And during that during that time, I worked in that group for almost a decade, and I picked up a degree in chemistry during that. So that was a lot of fun. Um, I always wanted to do things on the industrial side. I wanted to build something big that impacted a lot of people, and it's really hard to do that in academia, especially when we always work in a very large ecosystem, a lot of groups collaborating on everything, uh, which is great for innovation. What's not so great with that is IP assignment. It becomes very messy, especially as we were working across borders. Different universities have different policies, and sometimes you get in this strange situation where one country assigns the rights to the inventor and one country assigns the rights to the university. Um, so we wanted to get away from that, and that is how we spawned Biomimir, which is a medical device startup, but it was specifically we work in what we call like the squishy part of a medical device. So permanent implantable materials, um, hydrogels specifically that we use as wound fillers, and uh, we have a product that's now going through all of the regulatory work needed to bring that to market. That's mainly focused on both sealing a wound, but also allowing it to heal undisturbed. Traditional methods have constant intervention from medical health practitioners. Our product is a one and done sort of thing where you fill the wound and it gets to be left in place and it heals over time. Um, and the big thing that we're selling is that we do this without scarring. So there are some other products on the
Right.
market that have the same sort of approach to wound healing, that fills wounds and allows them to heal without intervention from nursing staff or physicians. But we have really good results, and we can do this without these wound scarring. So yeah, that's where I'm from, and that's what I do.
It's an amazing journey. I love the idea that you can cross over from academia into the world of startups, because I think you get the best of both worlds that way. You really have this foundation of learning, and then you get to take that learning and apply it in real time to a field that's just beginning to emerge in ways that we're just beginning to really get our hands around. But I'm curious, when you talk about healing of the wound, is this something that someone would get in surgery, or is it something somebody would get in combat, or is it both? Does it work in both particular areas?
The first product that we're working with, it had collagen is
Mm-hmm.
often the main component in materials like this. We also have a proprietary material that I can't talk too much
Yeah.
about, the magic sauce, you know.
Right.
However, uh, collagen demands cold chain shipping,
Mm-hmm.
which means that it isn't very good for field applications. It's very hard for a medic to carry around something that needs to be kept at 4 degrees Celsius, right? Um, and also, when you apply our current product, you need to properly debridle the wound, which is like clear away any damage or dead tissue and clear out any dirt from the wound. That's very hard to do in the field. So the first product will be going into the hands of physicians, both surgeons and general practitioners, emergency room physicians. Um, our, our main goal is to get this into um, the hands of physicians who treat hard to heal wounds, as we call them. So these
Mm.
are wounds that have chronic inflammation and either takes in the range of 9 to 12 months to heal, and some of these would never heal. These would be pressure ulcers or tunneling
Mm.
wounds or diabetic ulcers. However, the underlying technology, the technology that brings down anti-scarring to this product, doesn't really have the same constraints when it comes to storage and shipping. So we are developing a second generation product that will have a lower price point and will be possible to deploy in the field. We're both looking at getting this into the hands of military medics. We think that there's great use case there. But I would also love to see this in the hands of EMTs. Um,
Yeah.
the second generation material also, sometimes you have a really gruesome wound, right? Especially when we're talking trauma, um, and inflammation tends to be bad. Inflammation leads to shock. Inflammation leads to um, poor, poor healing outcomes, very severe scarring, and yeah, further damage to tissue. So we're hoping to help avoid that. And the second generation material should be possible to apply on the scene and then stabilize the patient for long enough that a physician or surgeon can evaluate the wound and then go in and excavate that and repair it in a surgical theater if needed. So that's both, but in the short term, it's definitely a thing we want to see in the hands of physicians.
It's wonderful to me. It's mind blowing to think about all the things that you're learning in the process of it. Not only are you helping science and the medical industry move forward by developing these technologies, but it seems there's a crossover too. Are there some things that you've learned while implementing this technology that you didn't think you would learn? Like, it seems like there's a lot going on there.
Absolutely. I mean, coming from academia, our constraints are very different, and they get to be a little bit strange. Um, in academia, we're cheap, but we're not. We're fine with something being a very expensive treatment per unit because we evaluate this in batches of, like, say, 3 to 10 maybe. Which means you can easily afford $10,000 for a treatment if you're only doing three animals or three patients. Like 10,000 is a very small amount for a grant, right? However, if we're talking about emergency room visits, right?
Right.
Um, that's entirely unfeasible. Um, so we've seen a lot. We did know this coming into this. It's one of the reasons why we were swapping over, because there's an incentive to push the envelope on high tech when you're in academia. But I have a little bit of a hard time grasping what the point is if your high tech solution comes with a price tag that's so high that it's never going to be implemented, never going to see patients outside of your pilot clinical trial. Um, so that's one of the main things we've really been working on, and that we've learned a lot about, like what the constraints are when you go to that market, what people are willing to pay for, what they're not willing to pay for, and some of the differences between. We're mainly focused on the Canadian and US market just
Right.
because of where we are located right now. We eventually want to go global, and we have our sights set on the EU and Asia as well, particularly India. We really want to break in there because it's a little bit of a walled garden. It's a very hard market to break into, but it's also a very underserved market. So I think, yeah, a lot of learnings there in what is feasible and what is not, and that's informed how we design materials. Um, what more? We've learned a lot about wound healing and how how physicians look at wound healing, because
Mhm.
our our first year was all hunting down physicians that deals with the
Mhm.
sort of wounds we want to treat, right? Like these really tricky, nasty wounds that honestly they're extremely common. We're talking about like somewhere between 20% to 50% of the total global population will have wounds like this at some point in their lifetime. Um, but there's very little common knowledge about it, right? Um, so we had to recruit really good medical advisors, which we've managed. We have some wonderful people here in Calgary working with us on that. We've also been in a program called Creative Destruction Lab, which we graduated this last summer. And through that, we've also gotten a lot of contacts with physicians and surgeons, mainly in Canada, but also in the US. We've definitely been surprised by some things. Understanding who's an early adopter and who isn't. Um, Honestly, wound care practitioners, like wound care physicians and surgeons, have been they've been extremely keen on new solutions. I think because
Mhm.
the current standard of care is
Right.
um, it causes a lot of strain. It causes a lot of pain. And some of the people we thought were going to be easy to convince because we were assuming that plastics, so plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery, would be a good entry point because these are people who are really keen on building a name for themselves and having the latest and greatest technology. However, um, I would say the population of doctors in that field is so extremely heterogeneous. Like it's so different doctor to doctor in how they approach medicine, who they want to treat, what volumes they're looking at, what price class they come in at. They So we've definitely gone away from that. I think our technology is really good for those people.
Right.
Um, but I think they're a very difficult market to go to first, um, because you basically need to sell to each individual. In that case, you need to convince every single person, and you never know going into a room whether or not they will be super gung ho on it
Mhm.
or entirely averse to it. So it feels like much more of a gamble. And I did. You were asking about learnings. I never thought that would be the case. I didn't think that what we sort of see as the sort of workhorse medicine, right? Like the ones that do the same thing every day and do massive volumes. I didn't think those were going to be the ones that were easiest to sell on new technology, but really because there are so many problems with the current standard of care, they have been extremely receptive. I don't think I've have had a single conversation with a wound care physician or wound care nurse, um, which hasn't come back with, when can we put this in our hands? Um, so that's been amazing. Honestly, amazing. It's been a lot of fun.
It's fascinating to me to get to hear. I see patterns developing. I see this pattern of you having this technology and helping wounds heal. And it also seems while that is happening, you're also creating relationships and having them heal. You know what I mean? Like they're almost side by side in that getting this technology to work and help wounds heal. You have to first help the relationships between healthcare and people heal. Like it's kind of synonymous in a way, right?
No, definitely. There's startups are a unique
Yeah.
space in that also, right? Um, Both me and Fiona, who's my wife and co-founder, um, we published some high-profile papers in the last few years in the field of regenerative medicine, um, and my wife more than me is a name in the space, um, as well as both of my former supervisors are very large names in the space, so like you get a little bit of spillover fame from that. Um, but because of the issues I was mentioning earlier about the cutting edge of
Yeah.
technology and what's actually sellable, um, you really started over from scratch in those relationships, right? If I went to a conference when I was in academia, it's enough to have the names on the poster for
Right.
people to want to talk to me, and we did get invitations to talk at some of the biggest conferences in regenerative medicine in the world to be actual speakers at that, which is amazing. And going to industry, um, there is a lack of communication between those two ecosystems. Um,
Yeah.
you're either quite thorough, quite set in the academic compartment, or you're quite set in the industrial compartment, and it those two systems talk less than you would expect them to. Um, and honestly, I'm very privileged in this because the groups I come out of are more professionalized or more industrialized than most. Like they have goals that are really to make usable solutions, to make
Right.
things that are viable as actual medical devices on the market, um, and still the knowledge on the industry side of what is the latest and greatest in academia is somewhat lacking. Um, so it's something we're trying to help sort, help fix. But it takes time, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful relationship, and I think it speaks to the idea that it's not either or, it's both and when you can merge the great people in academia with the people that are starting up in real world applications, I think that that's when you begin to see real wounds start to heal and we start moving forward in ways that we didn't know of before.
Yeah. I also see some of these. We were actually for everyone except George, who doesn't know, we had a talk about this before, about what the word regenerative medicine tends to imply, and to a lot of people who read about it in articles, or like popular science articles, or even coverage in major publications like Nature. They do their sort of weekly coverage of up and coming things. um, Regenerative medicine has become almost synonymous with cell therapies. which is interesting. I think there's a lot of promise in cell therapies, and I have done some work in that field and in that direction of regenerative medicine. However, we're very that technology is very, very young, and there is some constraints on the technology that will mean that there is a minimum price tag on anything like that,
Right.
because you need individual sterile handling and culture of cells going to any given patient, right? Um, it's very hard to scale a process like that, especially when we're talking about the really cutting edge, um, the big catchword now, right? Individualized medicine.
Yeah.
Um, and we've gotten far in individualized medicine when it comes to antibody therapies. So this can be things like HIV or viral therapies. It's the main one is for cancers, but we've also seen some development there in autoimmune disease. But that's antibodies, right? Um, and individualized is still for a specific subtype of a disorder. So individualized here can still mean 100 patients or 1,000 patients.
Right.
But when we're talking about individualized medicine and cell therapies, we're talking about one patient. And we're talking about setting apart a part of a facility for a single patient for several weeks and having a dedicated technician going in and taking care of these cultures. And that, of course, like we can only bring the price down so far for something like that, right? Um, I think we will get there. Like I think we will get there where regenerative cell therapy and regenerative medicine is an absolutely gigantic part of medicine. But I think that step is further away than a lot of pop science and a lot of news coverage sort of frames it. I think most scientists know this. Most people who work in academia in regenerative medicine knows this. Um, however, what we do is in material science
Right.
and cell-free materials for regenerative medicine. So instead of culturing cells in a dish, uh, we create materials that allow your own cells to thrive inside of them. So we're basically moving that from having that in a sterile room to having that inside of your wound. We're doing very similar things. We're taking your cells, we're expanding them in a healthy way to replace your damaged tissue. But we don't need to take when you do this for cell therapies, right? You often take a cell sample and then you expand that in the lab and then you put it back in.
Right.
We skip that step. We do that directly in the patient instead, which it strips away a lot of the costly steps in this, and that will allow us to reach a much larger population much earlier. And we've already seen revolutions in
Yeah.
this field of regenerative medicine over the last only since the mid 90s. We've seen a lot of this. I don't have the nice
Right.
graphic that Fiona tends to show, but we've had several generations of these materials, um, where we had the first generation that was just what's called biopolymers, so collagen or similar materials
Right.
that we just used to fill a wound, and that was it. And they work well. Um, then someone had the bright idea to, if this works well, if we have a more normal tissue, that might work even better. So second generation that came here with wound fillers was decellularized tissue, which is instead of heavily processing a tissue from an animal to extract this biopolymer collagen, you took the whole piece of tissue and you removed any cells, which
Mhm.
minimizes risks for immune complications, and then you implant that. That was generation two. But either of these things come with a lot of risks and a lot of
Right.
issues. We were always concerned about transmission of disease from animals to humans, what's called zoonotic disorders. Um, but then also, whenever you process tissue like that, you damage it. Like it's part of anything that's extracted, and the body recognizes damaged tissues, and that causes inflammation. Um, we consider ourselves to be part of a third generation of materials in regenerative medicine. Um, we make deliberately designed uh, biopolymers. And while, as I said in the beginning of this interview, we are using collagen right now, we're also developing several biopolymers. There are synthetic biopolymers that would act as a replacement for the collagen, which removes a lot of those issues. So, and the right now the component in our material that isn't collagen is a synthetic biomimetic polymer, as we call it. So
Mm.
a polymer that imitates um, the biopolymers that your body produces. So we can get the benefits without the downsides.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, we we really think that for the next 20 or so years, this will be the big movement in regenerative medicine, um, because the need is so very large. We're talking about the scale of, depending on which disorders you're looking for, somewhere between 20 billion
Wow.
US up to 147 billion um, annually that could benefit from this technology, which is absolutely. And now we're only talking about use of materials like this in operating theaters and clinics. This is not looking at field use at all. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a huge market, but market size correlates to the pain that the problem causes, right?
Right.
Like the market size here comes from um, the unfortunate state of things right now. The fact that we know that this is how many people need new solutions is rather sad. Like it's a
Yeah.
rather heavy thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so we're trying to get there as fast as we can, but we're still very small.
Mm.
We've just opened a second fundraising round, so we closed our first one early this year, and now we're raising money for this again. And for the people who, I know that you have quite a diverse
Yeah.
audience. For those who don't know, startups like ours aren't really expected to make money uh, very early in the process, because we have to comply with regulatory before we can make sales. So we need to raise many millions of dollars before we can make a single cent, um, which is a tricky place to be, right? Like you can't prove this as you're going just by getting customers and like showing that here are customers who want this thing. We need to build knowledge about the product, and we need to recruit key opinion leaders within the fields that we want to affect. And that is the big work as a startup founder in medicine, in any field of medicine, if it's medical device or pharma. um, you really need to build this profile, and you need to build a community
Mm-hmm.
that cares about the same things that you care about, because otherwise, even if you can raise the money to get to market, if there isn't knowledge about what you're offering among the users and among the customers, that's where it dies. It's a very strange place to be in. Also because this might be a long tangent,
No,
but
please.
um, in pharma, you do not like a pharma startup will either die very early on, like conceptualization stage. Basically, you cannot get strong enough evidence to get this approved. and in that case, your company is gone, right? Or you might be overtaken at some point a few years after your launch because someone comes up with something better. Um, but that's quite nice for investors because once you have lab evidence that this works well, you can be relatively certain that you will get the approval. And when you get the approval, you will get sales because pharma works that way. It wouldn't get to the market unless there was evidence enough to push that to clinics. Um, and also the organizations like the investors on that side push those new drugs really hard. Uh, Medical device is very different. Um, in medical device, it's still expensive to get it to market, but it's when we get to market, that's when we have to prove ourselves. Medical devices are never really proven in the eyes of the physician or in the eyes of investors until you have hit really good numbers when it comes to returning revenue. Unless you make sales, um, you're basically dead in the water. Like that's the danger zone for medical devices, which is quite unique. I will say it's very different from both um, startups that scale on revenue, and it's quite different from pharma startups.
It's fascinating to think about, and I don't know. I had no idea about that, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have no idea how that market works. And I think it sheds a lot of light on the regulations. It sheds a lot of light on you can have a fantastic idea, but it may die in the water, and it never gets out there for people to solve problems with.
Yeah, but this is why we do so much work on raising awareness about these things
Hmm.
and what the ongoing thing. The thing we're always asked about and the thing that we're always working on is find more advocates who work
Hmm.
within the field, especially physicians. Sometimes I'm asked about like, have you convinced the customers? But it's for us, it's not necessarily the customers we have to convince. Because in our case,
Right.
we're selling to hospitals,
Right.
hospital systems, clinics, right? The people who actually input the order in the system, the people who use this, it's the physicians. Um, so it's really we need to get the people on the ground to really want this so that they can then do our sales for us, so that
Hmm.
the people who want to use this um, pushes their administration to enable that. Um, so we're trying to have a bit of a grassroots movement in that. And honestly, it's part of the reason why I'm on here. I'm talking to
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
to get eyes on that and have people understand that we are at the cusp of a lot wound care really changing how it's done and who can be helped. Yeah, I think we're very close to a major revolution in that. Um, and I would want to see these products everywhere in the world. And with this type of technology, you can get there. You can get to the point where the price point is low enough that you can convince healthcare systems in parts of the world that doesn't have the same resources that we do in North America. So yeah.
It's beautiful to me. In some ways I see patterns and trends. The same way you're moving from academia into the startup, so too are you moving from the top down structure to the bottom up structure. When you come directly and you start a community, especially a grassroots community, you're going directly to the people that are going to benefit most from it, instead of trying to go through an agency and sell it all the way down. You're going right to the people and saying, this is what we have, this is what we believe we can do, here's the test, what do you guys think? Like that I really like that model, and I hope that trend continues in the world of healthcare. I think it's very beneficial.
Yeah, I think so too. I will say though, we're not we
Right.
we are not unique in that approach.
Right.
As startups in this space, it is what you have to do. The top down structure that you're talking about is only really viable if you already have the network
Right.
to push that to decision makers. Um, but startups don't have that. Unless you're a startup that's actually a spin out from a major
Right.
corporate entity, you don't have that amount of reach. So you have to create that reach yourself. And yeah, this is what we do. And it's interesting to see. I was I was never really involved in the startup community before I started a company myself. But Canada has an amazing startup community. Like it's very active. There's always events. There's In the last 2 years, I don't think there's been a single week where I haven't had at least one. Most of the weeks, two events that I attend, yeah, like outside of normal work hours, like evening events or
Right.
pitch events and competitions and conferences. It's nonstop, and I think that's really cool. It's really cool to be doing this during this period where there is so much movement and so much interest.
Yeah, it reminds me of there's a phrase that says collaboration leads to innovation. And it seems whether you're in the startup field or especially in the startup field, but maybe you could speak to that idea of collaboration and innovation.
Absolutely. It actually, I think that goes a little bit to something else you and I have talked about in the past, which is about the intersection between different disciplines. Um, um, not just medicine, but science in general
Yeah.
now is becoming more data driven. Um, and the traditional the traditional compartments in science and medicine um, are working less and less well, because to be able to utilize all of these amazing new tools we're developing on the IT and AI side, you have to have expertise in those things as well, and you have to build those things both with collaborations with groups who are on the other side of things, right? If you
Yeah.
come in from medicine and biology or in medicine chemistry, whichever, um, you really need to find a way of integrating the the other part of this. And I think it's important to both build knowledge as an individual in whatever the other side of that trench is, but you also need, of course, experts that come from the other side.
Right.
I think we need people who are experts in AI and computing, um, to inform themselves or get further education in the field of medicine, so that they properly understand the implications of how they analyze data, and so that they can critically evaluate their own results. And I think that this is true from the other side as well. If you come
Right.
from medicine, um, you can't just trust the other side to be doing it right when it comes to how they analyze data, because sometimes we have issues with translating
Right.
what data actually means, right? um, is a piece of data primary data, or is it a proxy for something else? And that informs how we need to analyze it. But as um, if these camps are entirely separated, we don't we miss those things. We miss the ability to find those issues and to evaluate the data in an appropriate way. So I think we need to strengthen collaboration between those sides of
Yeah.
things. But I also think that we need to culture an atmosphere where it's okay to have people come out of the opposite camp,
Yeah.
join groups or corporations that are traditionally of the other one. So I do think that more medical device and pharma companies need to hire AI experts, and I think that more, say, platform companies, drug development companies that come in from that really have the technical expertise in AI need to bring in more pure biologists or medical professionals to help them build their models and understand what the data actually means.
Yeah. Yeah. Lydia is over here. First off, thanks Lydia for putting some comments out there. She says, "I love it. Collaboration leads to innovation. Would this technology support autoimmune diseases?"
Definitely. So the question here, we talked about a lot of
Right.
things, and for the last 15 minutes or so, we haven't really talked about my technology.
Right.
Um, However, the materials we're working with, these biomimetics, they're really designed to interact with the immune system in a healthy way and shift the immune response from an aggressive, fast restructuring strategy into a slower, healthier type of tissue repair. So we're honestly trying to shift this away from traditional wound healing into having a scaffold that functions as a stand-in for as long as it takes to heal. And during that healing period, it it doesn't really heal like traditional wound healing. Instead, it functions as tissue repair, like your normal repair of healthy tissues, because like we're all made out of cells, right? All of us. Um, that's turned over quite quickly. Epithelium and keratinized tissue, which is what everything that you can see on me right now is that type of tissue. So my corneas are made out of that stuff. My hair is keratinized tissue. The top layer of my skin is the same. Uh, that stuff is turned over. Something between every 14 up to every 30th day or so. That's how long it takes to entirely replace those things.
Mhm.
Um, so we're using that. We're using that pathway to get healthier tissue to replace damaged tissue. But of course, the same thing goes for autoimmune disease, but because autoimmune disease is a shift of immune responses in the opposite direction, like in the direction that we are trying to stop. Um, and we've had a lot of thoughts on how to approach autoimmune disorders using this family of technologies, and we will continue hunting that down. However, um, the device classification for anything that will be used to treat autoimmune, because it's
Mhm.
um, we're talking about central systems and like blood circulation and these things, elevates it to a very high regulatory standard
Right.
anywhere in the world. Like, more or less, all of these ends up at the highest regulatory standard wherever you are in the world, which increases development costs. Um, so we want to leverage these first couple of generations of these technologies to start building revenue, and use that revenue to push products that come in at higher classifications or might even be classified as pharmaceuticals rather than medical devices, or in this case it's probably going to be called combination devices. They have to basically, we end up having to comply with both pharmaceutical regulation as well as medical device regulation, and products like that come with a very high price tag. I would say we're talking about the range of the very cheapest you can end up is probably around 5 million US, and that's very unlikely. Most of these will come in at 15 million US or more, assuming that you already have the infrastructure to build them. That's assuming that you already have a few products under your belt and you know how to build these and you don't need a new lab or anything. We're still talking about the low tens of millions to develop a single product in that space. Um, but I think the technology has the same promises there as it has in regenerative medicine, um, because we're talking about adjusting um, how the body's immune system functions and like bring that from a there is a thing I tend to nerd out about in this specific field, which is a lot of people talk about natural healing and all these things, right? What they forget is that modern medicine is a non-thing, on a non-existing thing on evolutionary timescales. Our immune systems and our repair systems uh, were evolved on a time scale that's in the millions to tens of millions of years. Um, there's been some shifts on the scale of like hundreds of thousands of years, but that's the quickest that we really see any large amounts of change. Like when we see population level changes, it's seldom faster than that. Um, 100,000 years ago, the needs of the human body for repair were different from what they are today. You were unlikely to live past the age of 40, which means that repair after the age of 40 didn't have strong evolutionary pressures on them. But the other thing is you didn't have antibiotics, which means that wound closure is insanely important. Like wound closure is more important than anything else for a human being living in the Stone Age, right? Because otherwise you get infection and you die. Um, and that's where scar comes from. We work on removing scar formation, and I can see a criticism leveraged against us, which is like we're going away from natural wound healing, and this is true. We are. I want to go away from natural wound healing because natural wound healing is not designed to function in the best interest of a human being today. It's designed to function in the best interest of a human being 100,000 years ago, or maybe a million years ago. These are no longer the same. We now have the ability to take care of each other, to make sure that wounds are continuously rebandaged or cleaned. We have antibiotics in case people get infections. In the case of autoimmune disorders, we have steroids to bring down immune responses. Um, so we really need to find ways of curating the responses of the human immune system to work well with modern medicine. We haven't really done this at this point. We're getting closer. As I was talking about earlier, the um, personalized medicine, especially in the antibody field, is very much working on this. It's looking at what goes wrong in immune response and how do we adjust this to make sure that faulty immune response doesn't kill people or cause undue suffering. But yeah, I think material science has a lot to offer there as well. And so for the non-scientists there, the reason why I'm talking about medical devices and material science in immune therapies has to do with how we deliver immune therapies right now. So a nanoparticle technology is well established now as a part of this, and the nanoparticles that we use to deliver active ingredients um, inform how these things function. Um, and how we design the materials and how we design particles decide where in the body and what cells and where in the cells we're sending active ingredients. Um, but there is an added step there that I think is very interesting, which is we know that the body reacts to surfaces and materials and chemical entities that aren't necessarily small molecules, that aren't pharmaceuticals in the traditional sense, um, but they still affect cell activity, they still affect immune response. Um, so the same materials that we are now using to fill wounds with, in theory, you can make those into nanoparticles, in which case they can help create that same kind of what we call tolerogenic behavior on a in the whole human system. Like this would be delivered then through your vascular system, through your blood, but that means that it will adjust your immune response throughout your entire body. I really think there's a big promise for polymer science and material science in that, and it is a that part of science, that part of medicine, is also one of these. It's a baby, just
Right.
like cell therapies. It's honestly almost younger. We've seen some great advancements in that in the last few years, or maybe the last decade. Um, and some of that honestly comes from regulators becoming more um, tolerant
Right.
of those technologies. We started with nanoparticles mainly being delivery technology for pharmaceuticals, but because we got them into the system through that,
Right.
we can now use the technology in different ways to help treatments. Yeah,
It's almost like a Trojan horse in a way. Like if you can
yeah.
introduce it, now all of a sudden you have this, it's already been in the system a little bit, and now there's all this promise for it. It's pretty amazing to think about. I didn't know about any of that.
I mean, it's regulatory frameworks are
Right.
extremely complicated and
Right.
obtuse. European Union is changing a lot of that lately also, and one of these things none of us say out loud, but I'm gonna do it anyhow,
I
which
love
is
it.
like the constant thing you hear whenever you talk to regulatory consultants or other startup founders in the space is that Europe is such a gigantic headache right now because they're shifting so much regulation at once. It is in exactly these things we're talking about. It's in cell therapy,
Right.
um, and it's in medical device, and it's in pharma. It's mainly in medical device and cell therapies, I will say. Um, so it's hard to work in the European Union at the moment because there's a lot of uncertainties. I do think that that will be calming down in the next couple of years, and I think that we will probably come out of it better than we went in. I do think in the end, the regulators in Europe will create a framework that is um, in everyone's best interest. But it's been a rocky 5 or 6 years, really. It's actually more than that now. Time runs faster with the older you get. Like
Yeah.
the last decade, which is the period where we have been working on this, and most of that time, honestly, we've been in, or a lot of that time, we've been in Europe. We started a lot of these projects when we were still in Europe, and we did a lot of work there in academia, and we had collaborators in industry. It was an exciting time. I'm hoping that we will soon live in less exciting times.
It's, there's a question that comes to mind in that you have an unusual perspective because you get to see all of this promise of what can be and actually developing these products that are making changes. But then you're up against these regulations that are sometimes very archaic. How do you balance that?
That's a very good. That's one of these like really big questions when it
Yeah.
comes to how we work and where we're at. Um, in some cases, this archaic framework works in our fashion. Sorry, in our favor, um, because there's a lot of technologies like the one I mentioned, right? That
Right.
gets grandfathered in, and it's an actual term used by the FDA, by a lot of regulators. More or less, we've had this thing on the market for a long time, and it doesn't really fit with the regulatory framework that we're now
Right.
developing. However, we will be the, we will basically let that old approval that wouldn't really be valid under current regulation still stand because we know that it's safe and efficient because it's been on the market for 20 years, right? Or in some cases 50 years.
Right.
Um, some of those things work in our favor, really. Our primary product, this anti-scarring wound filler I've been talking about, um, we will take that to the market in the United States before we do in Canada, even though the majority of our team are Canadian or live in Canada, because they have a pathway to use that part of the system. It's called a 510K, and it basically says that if you're similar enough to a previous device that has been approved under a certain regulatory framework, as long as you can prove that it is safe, you can bring it to market, uh, and that vastly decreases our costs. It makes it much easier to do product development. So in some cases, it's beneficial. But I was saying, then we have the other extreme of that, which is the European Union, um, where a lot of these changes that happened in the United States in the 90s are happening now, and they are larger, they're more sweeping. Europe has a more complicated like regulatory framework to
Right.
begin with because it's younger, um, and it's less interconnected. Um, and it's really it ends up affecting this a lot. And the way it's
Right.
affecting it is that Europe will be a much later market for us. We will have to go to market in the places that already have frameworks in place that allows us to go to market. And um, when we're in at the on the market in one place, we can build a huge amount of data on safety and efficacy, and we can leverage that when we go to more
Right.
complicated regulatory environments. And yeah, I hope that that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. It's it's a whole other dimension that if you're not involved in the field or you understand, like, it takes a while to wrap your mind around it. But I often wondered about that. Like, that seems like a very difficult, maybe not difficult, but a unique position to be in, to see both promise and the barriers to entry right there. It's a fascinating thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it causes some strange things also,
Sure.
right? Because one of the things we can see here is that some countries that have smaller GDP, and smaller like overall budgets for pharma development and med device development have simpler regulatory frameworks, and then they get targeted as early adopters for high tech technologies. It feels unintuitive to think
Mm,
that some of these places would get access to latest generation treatment before Europe does. Um, and also the UK with Brexit also ends up in one of these like sort of
right.
tricky situations when it comes to market entry. Um, so two of the places that you would expect to be the furthest along, right? The with
Yeah.
rich geographies, with people with very high requirements for medical treatment ends up being late adopters because of this. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate. I'm hoping that um, the regulators are working on simplifying their frameworks, on making good pathways for new products,
Yeah.
because I don't think this current thing is in anyone's best interest. Um, and it also, of course, leaves a lot of money on the table when it comes to development of cutting edge technologies, um, because most jurisdictions invest in products that are intended for that jurisdiction.
Hmm.
But if the richest jurisdictions ends up being the latest adopters, they're not the ones sponsoring that development. And I think that's bad for everyone. I think that's bad for everyone on this planet.
Yeah. It speaks to the idea of ethical concerns. Like, you're probably surrounded by them. What, maybe you could talk about that a little bit. That's got to be daunting.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is, but also some of the optics of ethics
Right.
become almost more concerns than the ethics themselves.
Ah,
I think that the group I'm working with, I think that our company, as well as all of the academic institutions I've ever worked with, have really high ethical standards.
right.
Um, but you have to be careful not just about the ethics, but the optics of ethics,
Hmm.
because if you enter into a situation where there's the potential for spin to be introduced by media, um, you can be quite certain that that's going to happen.
Hmm.
And I have lived through some of that. I have seen some of that in action, and it's a very, again, it's a thing that discourages innovation. It discourages development. The ugliest thing in that that I've seen, and I've seen for people, is the idea that if you test your product first in, say, India, we've seen this when we were in Sweden, like criticism against about testing things in India before we do in Sweden, because
Mm.
the way that the spin is put on that, right, becomes you're using poor people, or exposed people who don't have a better choice. And I know that when this was happening, um, that specific trial was run through the World Health Organization site, the largest World Health Organization site in ophthalmology that exists.
Hmm.
Um, it's a nicer site than I have ever worked at myself, and still you have local this local coverage that puts the spin on it. It's like evil Swedish people using poor Indian people, which is, it's entirely devoid of any connection to reality. Um, so having seen that, I've gotten very cautious in how you frame things and where you go. And again, it's very unfortunate that this is how the world works. Um, because we want to bring benefit to people as fast as possible, and in the places where it matters. I also think that that's kind of that idea that you can't uh, have uh, lower GDP countries be first adopters is also awful, because often the need for improvement in treatment, in medical treatment, is the greatest there.
Right.
Um, so yeah, you're walking a tightrope when you're trying to deal with those things, and when you're communicating about those things. Yeah,
It speaks to the idea of complexity. I wish it was as easy as good and evil or good and bad, but the complexity is just it's probably a lot like creating medical devices. It's the complexity of it is mind blowing.
yeah. Medicine is a medicine moves so very fast
Right.
today, but also it's so very disparate depending on where in the world you are. Like um, some of the coolest medical technologies I've ever seen are in places where you, like, honestly, there is some racism in that. There's some prejudice in that, where people in North America thinks that we're ahead of the curve, and then you see these sites um, in India or in China or Indonesia, and they have resources that it will be 10 years until we have them in North America. It's a little bit ridiculous, I think. And I think people need to be a little bit more open-minded when they're looking at geographies. I wanted to point out, we are hitting time now.
Yes, I know. I love talking to you. So
No, say likewise, likewise.
I'm really thankful. Before I let you go though, maybe you could tell people where they can find you and what you have coming up.
Absolutely. The best way to connect with me is over LinkedIn. My name should be on here, and the company that I am a founder of is Biomimir. I have Edin AI as well. That one has lower levels of activity right now. We're working on restructuring that one. But yeah, connect with me over LinkedIn. Send me a message. Follow Biomimir. Um, and yeah, the things that are coming up is really, we're very active in the startup scene in both Calgary in Alberta, as well as in Montreal and Sherbrooke in Quebec. Um, we almost always have a representative visiting a local startup group called Startup TNT, which is an investment group, but they hold socials. So every Thursday, if anyone here is in Alberta, come and visit that. You should be able to find Startup TNT on LinkedIn as well. They're great people, and yeah, we work closely with them, and we're always there. Someone from our camp is always there. So if you want to meet us in person, that's where to find us.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please go down to the show notes, check out everything that they're working on. It's incredible technology. We're really moving into a world that has a lot of promise. And I'm really thankful for your time today. I'm happy to learn as much as is out there. And I really think that the technology is promising. So ladies and gentlemen, go to the show notes, check everything out. Thank you very much for your time today, Elle. And that's all we got. Ladies and gentlemen, aloha.
Thanks so much. Bye.